Do
Okay.
what thou wilt, show me the whole of the law. Welcome, everybody, to the Esoteric Antecedents of Thelema class. And we're completing our first segment, which included some Renaissance figures, but we've been spending a lot of time in antiquity looking at some mystical and magical texts. And we're now going to take a look at the last great pagan um, philosopher of the Roman Empire. There are just a few further pagan philosophers after the end of the empire, Proclus being the major figure. And of course, there are a number of major Christian intellectual figures in the late empire, which Augustine is the major figure, but there's a number of other people also. St. Jerome. I think Tertullian is a little earlier, but um, we're coming to the end of what's sometimes called the patristic period, but it's all the period of the church fathers. But there's a parallel process going on within paganism in Roman antiquity, where there's also a kind of reassessment of the pagan religious tradition in light of the political conditions of the late empire. It turns out that due to the contingencies of history, Christianity wins out in the culture war that ensues as the Roman Imperium, the Pax Romana, is coming to an end, and things become unsettled. And there's an attempt to reorganize, and in particular, under the reign of the Emperor Constantine. His dates as Emperor 312 to 336 of the Common Era, and he famously converts to Christianity. And this was done for political purposes because he was basically, his thing is that he conflated the Roman senatorial class with the network of Christian bishops. So bishops basically became senators and senators became bishops. And what this meant is he could use the existing Christian ecclesiastical system to further reorder and reconsolidate the bureaucratic system of civil society in the Roman Empire, which was undergoing rapid decay at that point. And he was largely successful in stabilizing the empire for a period of time as a Christian empire. At the time that Constantine converted to Christianity and politically shifted the empire to that faith, the roughly total population of Christians in the empire was maybe only about 10% of the population, which is actually significantly large for any particular specific what you could call religion that wasn't just the more general. Remember that the paganism in the Roman Empire is a civic folk tradition rather than one that's based on what you would think of as a confessional faith. So you're not necessarily, you subscribe allegiance to the political unity of the Roman Empire as a whole, represented by the titular function of the emperor, who's kind of functions as a living god. And then there's the gods of Rome that you owe allegiance to, but how those are represented or what that means, there's a lot more the focus is more on the particular regional cultic rites and rituals. And these are diverse. The particular god or goddess that might be venerated in some particular temple in some particular city is going to be different than the one that's down the street. And so in one sense, this is a religious system that covers the entire empire. In another way, it's internally not so tightly differentiated in the way that more confessional or scriptural based traditions like Rabbinic Judaism, Pauline Christianity, eventually Islam, and other traditions that like Manichaeism that have now died out as a living faith, but at the time were going concerns. And what Constantine does is he basically picks one of these and makes that the official religion of the Roman Empire because it has more cultic cohesion. And in fact, it is in the late empire increasingly a problem that uh, the older pagan religious tradition, which is linked to the paideia, the educational system, the upper class, the senatorial class in the Roman Empire, is losing its cohesion. And there's a kind of debate that occurs in Neoplatonism between the followers of Plotinus and the followers of Iamblichus with regards to the status of the rites and rituals that occurs in the temples. And this is important because it both underscores the political tensions going on in the competition between religions in the later Roman Empire, but it also underscores particular problems that are specific to late Roman paganism. So Iamblichus, his dates are 240 roughly to 325 roughly of the Common Era. The later part of his life overlaps with the reign of Constantine. Remember, Constantine's years are 312 to 336. Iamblichus is 240 to 325. Iamblichus is earlier than the last pagan emperor, who's the Emperor Julian, sometimes called the apostate from a Christian point of view, of course. And his dates as emperor were 361 to 3, which seems like a short period of time, but actually did pretty well because the average lifespan for emperors at that time was about 18 months or so. So he managed to beat the average a little bit, and he died the same way all these emperors in the later empire died. He died in battle, fighting the encroaching so-called barbarians, groups attempting to move into the empire that the Roman legions were increasingly inefficient at being able to keep out. And this eventually causes the control of the central authority in Rome, or if you're in the east, Constantinople, to decay, and they can't keep order. And although in the east they're able to keep things going more or less for another 1,000 years, as the Byzantine Empire in the west, it collapses into these competing little feudal mini states, many hundreds of them in Western and Northern Europe. And they proceed to have a civil war with themselves for about the next 1,000 years or so until this thing called capitalism gets developed for complicated and contingent historical regions. And then whereas the Islamic Caliphate became, after the fall of Rome, the major world civilization in this part of the world. There's China elsewhere, but they're a little far away. So in this part of the world, the Islamic Caliphate and Islamic civilization takes over from Rome as the primary cosmopolitan civilization. But then this thing called capitalism starts getting developed as colonial expansion is occurring with these European little states, and they're sending out trading missions, and they're getting super rich because they discover the so-called New World, which they begin to plunder, and then they get all this money, and then that initiates this chain reaction, which eventually becomes industrialization. And then these previously marginalized, feuding little mini states in what had been the western part of the Roman Empire take over the planet in the 17th through 19th centuries. And then Christianity becomes Latin Christendom becomes Christianity becomes, in either its Protestant or Catholic form, the global hegemonic religion. But Iamblichus comes earlier, this cusp point before any of that has really happened. The date when paganism becomes illegal in the Roman Empire is 386. So that's a ways ahead. And basically what's going on is that the dominant philosophy in the late empire is Plotinus's Neoplatonism. And it emphasizes meditative contemplation and ascetic disidentification with the world. And you're supposed to transcend out of your body. And the problem is that all the things that you do publicly, socially, to maintain paganism as a religion, as a religio, as a thing that binds people together socially, no longer seem to really have a purpose in this late version of Platonic philosophy that's going on. So Iamblichus comes along and he is the champion of the magical rites that go on in pagan temple worship. And his argument against the Platonians is that no, it's not contemplation that gives the highest gnosis, that gives the highest energizing of the soul to achieve union with the divine one that's beyond time and space, the ground of being. No, it's theurgic rites that are most efficacious to energize the soul into union with the one. And he calls the category that includes all of these rituals, animal sacrifices where you cut the liver out and you look at the bumps and you can do divination, oracles that you derive, the pronunciation of the so-called barbarous names of evocation, these long strings of vowels that invoke the gods, the sense of epiphany, of the presence of the divinity during the sanctification of the temple that occurs during the rites, the performance of the rites, the ecstasy, the visionary ecstasy achieved by the participants. This is all called theurgy by Iamblichus. And in many ways, what Crowley means by magic with a K is basically cognate with this category of theurgy. These are really the same category. It's just that magic is a updated modern version of theurgy, which has been philosophically rethought and developed through all the stuff that happens in the intervening centuries. So it's useful then to look back at Iamblichus's conception of theurgy because it gives us clues. It shows us the basic motifs, the building blocks that go into what eventually is going to become Thelemic magic. And of course, Thelemic magic also includes mysticism, which is the type of contemplation, broadly speaking, that Plotinus is interested in. So again, it's a synthetic category. And Iamblichus, of course, is not against contemplation as a pious religious practice to advance the soul. He just has this idea that ceremonial magic is not just as effective, but is in some cases more effective at energizing the soul into theurgic union with the divine. And indeed, I think it's this somatic encounter with the divine, this dramatic social engagement that is the thing that Iamblichus, I think, gets right. That although he's entirely a Platonic dualist, as all the Neoplatonists are, because that's what philosophy was for them, at the same time, there's a kind of implicit awareness, you might also almost say to Freudian sense, an unconscious awareness that this kind of dualism involves a number of philosophical problems and issues, and that the de-emphasis on the body disconnects you from the kind of cultic practices that are in fact the basis of bringing people together into religious spirituality. And the Christians, you see, are not having a problem with this at this time, because they're not so focused on Platonic dualism. They certainly believe that they're certainly supernatural dualists in the sense that they think that the salvation that they anticipate in their worship is going to happen in another world after they die, or that there's going to be an apocalypse that's imminent where this world is passing away. But in the meantime, they've got plenty of stuff to keep them active and busy in this life, including a rich culture of public worship where they celebrate the Eucharistic Mass. And there's prayers and there's all kinds of stuff that basically come from Jewish prayer and observance, but have been Christianized, and it gives you plenty of stuff to do when you get together with your ecclesia and have your ritual meal together. And the pagan rites that should be equivalent to this are instead declining because of the increasing philosophical asceticism of the Neoplatonism. So Neoplatonism has this complex role where it's both the philosophy that's most explicitly magical and therefore of interest to us because it emphasizes ceremonial magic and rites in a way that's relevant to the type of ritual activities that we're engaged with. At the same time, precisely the reason that it has this element is because there are tensions and problems and contradictions within the culture and philosophy of paganism at this time that are causing precisely those traditions to decline. So Iamblichus represents a philosophical attempt to address this. Let me read a passage from you. His main work is something called On the Mysteries of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Assyrians. Iamblichus has this conception that the rites, that he's Syrian, and so he's practicing in the Eastern now. He speaks and reads and writes in Greek. And his conception is that the particular theurgic temple rites that he's practicing have been inherited from the ancient Egyptians. Now, this is historically not, it's an earlier version of Ficino's myth of origins of the Prisia Theologica, the pristine original, the primordial tradition, as it were. And this is always a mythological concept because the actual form of rites and rituals that are practiced in any given period do have a historical relationship to what's gone on in the past, but it's more complex and genealogical and interpretive. And it's never just a direct, exact, isomorphic transmission of exactly what they were doing in the past and what they're doing now. Just like, you do occasionally encounter the Gardnerian Wiccans who think the 3-degree system that they're working is what how witchcraft was practiced like back in the Neolithic Ice Age or whatever in in the Alps or something. And this isn't true, even though there is a real historical connection between what we're doing and what's going on in the past. And so when we look at these texts, like by Iamblichus, like by Porphyry, like by Plotinus, like the Sefer Yetzirah, like all the stuff we've been looking at in this class, what we're doing is we're reconnecting to that actual lineage, which in a way was never lost. It's just, it keeps getting forgotten or covered over. And we have to just, all we got to do is just peel back those layers and we can see it again. But when we encounter it, we're going to encounter it in its historical complexity. And that historical complexity is just as complex as the historical complexity and diversity we encounter today as well. As one of my professors in seminary said, there's this mythology that we all have that the past was simple and the present is complex. But in fact, the way that he put it, is just a mess all the way back. It's never not a mess. It's always a mess all the way back. But the interpretive wager, I think, one can have as a intelligent and engaged reader of history is that the thing you discover when you engage with that mess, that complexity, is that complexity turns out to be much more rich and interesting than the myth of the simplistic, perfect, wonderful past. that people in the past had this same myth. So Cicero talks about, you remember we were looking at him a few weeks ago. He was, what was he saying? Well, I believe in the gods because my noble ancestors who were pious and good, not like the present where everybody's wicked, but in the past, our noble ancestors were pious and good, and that's why we should uphold the traditions that they gave us. Well, anybody who studied Roman history knows that Cicero's ancestors were not pious and good. They were just as politically gangster, ruthlessly messed up as his own generation. Basically, Iamblichus has the same conception. And so he writes, and this I'm reading this passage to both because it's a famous quotation from Iamblichus that is often cited, but also because I want to underscore the basically conservative nature of Neoplatonic philosophy, because that allows us to critically understand that element of it, and then we can then be more creative in our own interpretation. But we first have to understand what the original texts are doing. So Iamblichus writes, for if anything else in religious legal institutions is adapted to the gods, this must certainly be immutability, the immutability of religious rites. And it is necessary that ancient prayers, and he means here the barbarous names of evocation, these long, sonorous strings of seemingly nonsense vowels that are uttered by the priests during their invocations. And it is necessary, Iamblichus writes, that ancient prayers should be preserved invariably the same, neither taking anything from them nor adding anything to them which is elsewhere derived. For this is nearly the cause at present that both names and prayers have lost their efficacy, because they are continually changed to the innovation and illegality of the Greeks. By Greeks, he means people who are part of the Hellenic paideia, part of civilization. People today, in other words, who get things wrong. For the Greeks are naturally studious of novelty. They're carried about everywhere by their volatility, neither possessing any stability themselves, nor preserving what they have received from others, but rapidly relinquishing this. They transform everything through an unstable desire of discovering something new. But the barbarians, and here he just means the ancient Egyptians, are stable in their manners and firmly continue to employ the same words. Hence they are dear to the gods and proffer words which are grateful to them, but which it is not lawful for any man by any means to change. Unquote. Okay, well, contrast that with what Aleister Crowley says in Liber O and elsewhere in his magical instructions, where he says, the rituals and rites that you make up yourself creatively are going to always be more efficacious than the ones that you're officially given by the tradition. So go out and be creative. Okay, well, you could see immediately that there's a basic difference in perspective here. And at the risk of oversimplifying this, I think it is correct, nevertheless, to say that this is basically the distinction between modern and traditional viewpoints. That modern subjectivity is innovative, creative, directed towards the future, and traditional subjectivity is static, conservative, and looks to the past. So we just need to keep that in mind, because when we're reading Iamblichus, I think we're reading him for different purposes than he intended his own text to be read. And that's fair, but we need to acknowledge that this is the case. And then, having acknowledged that, we can then proceed with that critical understanding. What I think is valuable about reading ancient magical texts is that we can do what Martin Heidegger calls a hermeneutical repetition. And what this means is that you read some text from the past and you're able to interpret it in such a way that certain interpretive valences that are indeed available and present in that text are brought out in the new contemporary interpretation, but they're valences of meaning that remained implicit and undeveloped in the past in terms of how people were interpreting those ancient texts. And so we're, in a sense, refreshing those texts for a more modern experience when you reinterpret them in a way that brings out certain, again, interpretive valences that are implicit in the text that lay latent and underdeveloped in the original historical context of the text. And if you approach a philosopher like Iamblichus like that, there's all kinds of riches to mine out of his texts in what might otherwise seem to be a somewhat imponderable and obscure philosophical text from a now dead philosophical tradition. So let's see. Let me describe the basic innovation, or one of the basic innovations in Iamblichus now. So there's kind of this threefold movement is Gnostic philosophies develop in the Roman Empire. And I do include Neoplatonism as a kind of Gnosticism, even though Plotinus wants to distance himself from so-called Gnosticism, particularly over the issue of whether the cosmos is good or not. And that's an issue we discussed last week. And if you want more information about that, go take a look again at the recording for that week where we discussed that more fully. But basically, what a lot of these Gnostic spiritualities do in the earlier part of the Common Era, in the 1st and 2nd century, is they're proliferating all these elaborate hierarchies of being, these Gnostic archons or eons that interpose between the divine pleroma, which is beyond space and time that you're trying to return to have your soul separate from the body and escape from the cosmos. And then Plotinus comes along, and he's unsatisfied with this proliferation of layers. And so he wants to collapse it down just into a few principles again. So his version of Gnosticism is that there's basically just 4 orders of being. There's prime matter that's informed by souls to have material shape and phenomenal appearance. There's the domain of soul forms. And then there's the demiurge, which is also called the intellectual principle. And then there's the one that's beyond space and time. So that's it. Those are the four categories. Then Iamblichus comes along and he realizes there need to be more intermediary layers between the demiurgic intellectual principle and the domain of the embodied human soul to assist in the mediation between these two levels. And furthermore, the purpose of theurgy is to interact with this spiritual or demonic meaning just the world of spirits, different spiritual entities. There needs to be this whole spiritualistic dimension that also includes the place where you can have visions, for example, receive oracles, communicate verbally with different gods and rites, all kinds of things that facilitates the epiphany of the divine for the soul. And that theurgy then is preeminently the discipline of practices for interacting with this, what's called the divine hierarchy of the universe. And it's what in later, more modern philosophy will be called this thing called the great chain of being. But the person who preeminently, although it originates in a way with Plotinus, the person who actually more fully develops this as a theme is Iamblichus. And then that's picked up by Julian and also this later philosopher Proclus. And then that finds its way into later versions of Hermeticism that have these Kabbalistic works that have this angelology, that you're going to use magic to communicate with different angels as you go up or down these different hierarchies of being. And so that's going on in Kabbalah, but also different types of Christian spiritualism, which has its own long history. And of course, Muslims are doing this all too. So, but all this type of magical practice is finding its late antique formulation in the philosophy of Iamblichus. So he writes, if you want to look this up, this is in section 1, subchapter 5. So he says, there is therefore the good itself, that's the one, beyond time and space, which is beyond essence, and there is that good which subsists according to essence. And that's the first primary emanation of the one, or the good, which is the demiurge, or the intellectual principle, the realm of forms, which is then the seed source of the different forms that then are infused into matter to give the universe its shape and substance. Iamblichus continues, I mean the essence which is most ancient and most honorable, and by itself incorporeal. Remember, beyond space and time. And this is the illustrious peculiarity of the gods, which exist in all the genera that subsist about them, preserving their appropriate distribution and order through this hierarchy, and not being divulged from it, and at the same time being inherent with invariable sameness in all the gods and their perpetual attendance. So it's a kind of both end for Iamblichus. There's the divine that's beyond time and space, but then that infuses its essence into all the different descending links or chains or ladders or steps in this ascending and descending divine hierarchy of being, the divine governance of the cosmos. And then he writes, in souls, however, which rule over bodies and which precedentiously pay attention to them, and which prior to generation have by themselves a perpetual arrangement. Sorry, let me skip ahead here. Okay, so there's this medium that mediates between these two extremes. The absolute good beyond time and space, and the embodied soul that's enmeshed with matter. So he says there's this other medium, which is suspended from the gods, though it is far inferior to them, and it is that of the daimons, which is not of a primarily operative nature, but is subservient to and follows the beneficent will of the gods. It's subject to divine guidance. It likewise unfolds into energy, the invisible good of the gods. Energy is that which permits change and activity to occur. It likewise unfolds into energy, the invisible good of the gods, being itself assimilated to it, and gives completion to its fabrications conformably to it. For it renders that which is ineffable in the good of the gods effable, illuminates that which is formless in forms, and produces into productive forms that which in divine good is above all reason. Receiving also a connascent participation of things beautiful, it imparts and transfers it, in an unenvying abundance to the genera posterior to itself. These middle genera, therefore, give completion to the common bond of the gods and souls, and cause the connection of them to be indissoluble. Okay, so that's then the idea of how magic works, is that you're then working with this visionary, demonic, spiritual realm, which is divided up into all these parts, where there's the disembodied ethereal souls of gods and heroes and spirits and angels and demons, and you can communicate theurgically with all these levels of being. And by doing that, you yes, this is that ruach level that contains all these dimensions. And that then also links and connects to the what we would now today call the psychological functions of the psyche. But in ancient times, it was thought that the soul would be energized or moved or affected by different spirits that would enter into communion with it. And so if you felt an emotion, that was because like a spirit of sorrow had entered your soul and you were being kind of possessed by that. So again, we think of our subjectivity as being centered in a individual private consciousness that has this kind of totality to it. Ancient people didn't experience their subjectivity that way, and so their soul was much more permeable to all these other levels of being that are constantly mixing with and affecting it. And this is like with the domain of sympathies and natural magic, where you can enter into communion with. You're seen as being in a continuum with nature, and everything kind of flows together. And what's called the soul is also this aspect of yourself that also keeps you apart from nature at the same time, and then can also have rationality to it, which can then separate itself from these more natural levels of being and ascend. But it's all divided up into these parts that don't have quite the same sense of unification to them that we experience ourselves of as Cartesian subjects. And so in that sense, we're having a different we have a different psychological experience of ourselves. The point I'm making though is that theurgy is equivalent to another word that Iamblichus uses called demiurgy. So the idea is that through the practice of theurgy, you participate in the divine governance of the cosmos. You take up a role or part in that is your unique contribution as part of the system of creation. And this is important because it's the part of Iamblichus's philosophy that's closest to the Thelemic concept of the true will. And this is even more explicit because it turns out that your knowledge of how to correctly engage with theurgy so that you're then practicing demiurgy, you're cooperating with the demiurge in the governance of the cosmos, so that when you give orders to the spirits to do this or that, it's as if you're acting as the god when you do that. The participant in the divine rites for Iamblichus undergoes a kind of theosis where they themselves become a god. And so that's why they can command the spirits to go out and, save the crops or make sure that there's peace in the state and this war gets resolved. You could have the divination and you could do this, that, or the other thing that bestows benefit on your community through magical invocation. But you're not seen as mixing then yourself with matter in a bad way, because see, that would be the Plotinus objection. Because how is this not thaumaturgy then, where you're just, as Crowley says, trying to bewitch your neighbor's cow, which all these philosophers think of as something impious. So how is theurgy not impious like that? Because you're interacting with all this daimonic level of reality, and you're engaged in all these activities like having visions, going into ecstatic states, propitiating the gods, doing sacrifices, undertaking divinations, practicing, doing this, that, or the other thing, saying prayers. And whereas for Plotinus, you should be withdrawing from all activity. You should just be sitting in quiet meditation, alone with the alone. And so demiurgy is Iamblichus's answer to that. Because if you take on the role of and become, your soul is energized in the union with the one, you are a god then as you perform these rites, then it's appropriate for you to perform these rites, because the function of the gods is to rule the universe, rule the cosmos, and establish the, what is it? It says in the, as Homer says, so that the justice of Zeus might be done in the world. So you have to play your role in that. So then that becomes the function of theurgy. Now, what's important about that is that this is mediated to the practitioner by a personal divine genius that's assigned to them at the moment by the divine governance of the cosmos at the moment of their generation, when they're born, and it rules over their horoscope. And of course, this is the higher and divine self. This is the holy guardian angel. That is this thread, is this theme that runs through all these later versions of theurgy into the medieval and early modern period, and then becomes the basis for the second order practices of the magical cultists and the heretic order of the Golden Dawn. And then Crowley picks that up, and he's looking at Mather's translation of the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin, or Abraham the Limb the Mage, and he's like, aha, this is it. This is the essence of magic, is to achieve the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel, and then you know what your true will is, and then you in a sense divinize yourself. You become a god, and that's exactly what's going on in Iamblichus. And this is the classical formulation of it. So there's this direct connection to what's going on in ancient times with what Thelema is doing. And to be frank, this is also, I think, explicit in Jewish Kabbalah, in the Kabbalistic tradition, perhaps in its most purest, clearest expression in Judaism, in a way that this type of esoteric gnosis gets a little bit more suppressed by exoteric religion in Islam and Christianity, in public orthodoxy, whereas in Judaism, this type of esotericism is much more closely and deeply connected with the mainstream rabbinical tradition and continues to be part of their discourse. And then you have the development of this additional commentary tradition of the Kabbalistic text, which is, again, also not separable from the rabbinical tradition, which is not to say that all rabbis are doing Kabbalah, but this connection is more explicit in medieval Judaism. And particularly Isaac Luria's concept of tikkun is basically the same functionally as the concept of demiurgy. It's the kind of Kabbalistic uptake of their repetition, hermeneutical repetition, or reinterpretation in their own context of what had originally been a Neoplatonic theme, but of course then has its versions that continue in Christian mysticism, Islamic Sufism, and Jewish Kabbalah. So the idea of tikkun is that you're attempting to redeem the shattered fragments of the tree of life as it's got too much light flowing into it. It broke apart. And so through mitzvot, through halakhic observance, infused with Kabbalistic gnosis, where you're performing this observance and you also know or understand what it is and what you're doing and why you're doing it, to achieve this kind of mystical reunification of the cosmos, which then brings about the immanence through the resacralization of the world through observance, the messianic world to come becomes present in the present moment. And you're able to collapse that, make a strange loop in time, and collapse the future into the present through a kind of magical invocation. And this is the ideal of tikkun. And so again, these are all themes that reach their fullest explicit pagan magical expression in this type of Neoplatonism, but then that gets transmitted into the future and then to our time, and then we're very much continuing to be practitioners in that tradition. Let me read you one more passage from Iamblichus about the divine genius, because this is the bit that most particularly relates. Let's see. He says, when the particular demon or the peculiar daimon is present with each of us, he then unfolds the worship which is proper to be paid to him in his name, and likewise delivers the proper mode of invoking him. Okay. So when the holy guardian angel manifests, it gives us the information of how to properly worship them, delivers their name, and unfolds the rites particular to that. Okay. So then he says, for the peculiar demon does not rule over one of the parts in us, but over all the parts at once, and extends to every principle within us in the same manner as he was distributed to us from the total orders in the universe. So again, this is the spiritual principle that unifies or totalizes the self. And for Iamblichus, that means energizing the self into the soul into union with the one. We would say that it provides self-gnosis that enables the psyche to more deeply totalize itself, come into communication with its unconscious, resolve its psychological complexes. And this allows magic to function as a kind of psychotherapy, a kind of self-therapy. Again, this derives from Freudian psychoanalysis, and yet all of this has this roots in antiquity in these mystery traditions. Okay, one more thing. There's one other useful bit in Iamblichus that I want to cover before we open to questions. And that's the function of the ritual symbols in rites. So he says, for the perfect efficacy of ineffable works, which are divinely performed in a way surpassing all intelligence. He's describing the magical rituals that you're doing. And the power of inexplicable symbols, which are known only to the gods, impart theurgic union. Hence, we do not perform these things through intellectual perception, since if this were the case, the intellectual energy of them would be imparted by us, neither of which is true. For when we do not energize intellectually, the synthemata, the theurgic signs or symbols, themselves perform by themselves their proper work, and the ineffable power of the gods itself knows by itself its own images. Okay, what's he saying here? What he's saying is that when you use particular symbols or emblems in magic, the emblem or symbol, in virtue of being a sign or signifier, he doesn't have this semiotic language, but instead he talks about the word he uses is synthemata, basically means symbol. So symbols have a magical efficacy because their sign or signifier participates in the divine just the same way that the soul participates in the divine. And so the symbol, it's as in terms of its form, that form, like the soul principle, which is also a Platonic form, participates in the divine spirit. And so by looking at or encountering in ritual or working in ritual with symbols, those symbols act to directly magically act on the soul to energize it. And what I think is so useful and interesting about that, and this is in response to the idea, well, just pure meditative contemplation achieve union with the divine. And Iamblichus is saying, no, not just meditation, also symbolism, working with symbolism. But that means that language functions as the part of, or the main medium of the great magical agent that is what makes magical rites efficacious. Okay, but then what we've got is basically the basis for what we can, as modern interpreters, retroactively look into this text and say, okay, this is a basis for a semiotic theory of magic. And we can ground it all, we can go all the way back to Iamblichus and also Porphyry. Remember the Cave of the Nymphs from a few weeks ago, where again, we're talking about the allegory and symbol as the means to practice magic and affect the soul. And so we can use that as a basis to come up with a theory of magic that can still be grounded in the Iamblican concept of theurgy, but doesn't rely so much on the Platonic dualism that's inherent to the kind of Neoplatonism that is the historical context of these texts. And on that basis, we can reinterpret them in more modern philosophical terms. And so we can conceive of the world that we're part of, as a kind of magical universe, a kind of virtual reality that's constructed by language and by our involvement with language. And then through the self-conscious manipulation of language, we can reprogram our relationship to that linguistically constructed consensus reality. And then we can de-alienate ourselves from the way that we've been programmed by that consensus reality to function in a mediocre way in terms of what our sense of personal identity is, in terms of the sense of ourselves we inherit from our class, from our more limited social positioning and conditioning. And we can make more creative use of our human potential through a kind of neuro-linguistic reprogramming of ourselves, all of which is magic. And by looking back at Iamblichus, what I think is so fascinating is when we look at these passages where he talks about magical symbolism and how it's the symbol itself as a kind of sign or signifier that then changes, modifies, energizes the soul to have some kind of movement or potentiality. That's a useful concept to update, and we can see how we can then conceive of our own practice in those terms where, so for example, in Jacques Lacan's interpretation of psychoanalysis, the Oedipal complex he reads as the way that children are socialized into language, and that to become a speaking subject, we have to undergo what he calls the Oedipal cut of castration, symbolic castration, so that we're opened up to the symbolic order. And this cuts open or opens up our infantile narcissism. And so we're able to transcend that and develop a more complex psyche based on social roles and relations that we have with others that are posited through language. But then we're also alienated and traumatized and undergo restriction. Book of the Law calls restriction due to that same programming. So we have to get savvy about that. And magic then becomes this way to reappropriate the way that language makes the world and makes subjects within the world. But we're the speaking subjects whose language, it's our language. We're the ones who are the gods who speak the world into being through that language. We've just forgotten that we have that role. And so we're programmed by language rather than being the ones who program ourselves with language, you see. And so we can get back to that more basic understanding, that gnosis. We can then use something like the semiotic theory of magic that is outlined in this book alongside of all kinds of other ideas that are in play in our system of magic, and have this constructive modern interpretation of magic that is Iamblican, even while at the same time having a critical and constructive relationship to the Iamblican corpus, his texts, some of which no longer relate to our current philosophical concerns. But there's a way to reread him, which I hope I've hit some of the milestones of here. I'm going to pause at this point. We're coming up on 3 o'clock. I want to open to some questions and comments. Let's see if we can spend the last half hour of this class, because this is also the last class in this part of the course. And so we can also talk about how this all relates to earlier courses as well, maybe try to tie this all together, have a nice concluding conversation for the course as a whole. So questions, comments, discussion. Please, anyone jump in.
Nathan, I'm curious how much you think that like really going into where semiotics kind of like branched off into kind of our modern conception of semiotics, and especially like as a excuse me, as a language and communication theory, might be useful to the magician understanding the philosophical basis of it.
Sure. Well, there's something called the language turn in philosophy that occurs in the 20th century. Just before I jump into that, the text we've been looking at is called On the Mysteries of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Assyrians. We've been specifically looking at the translation that was done of this book by Thomas Taylor in 1821. And it's a famous translation, which is also a really good translation. This was republished in 1999 by the Prometheus Trust. I don't know anything about a controversy about this text. This is largely the standard text for this book of Iamblichus. There has been a more recent translation, I think something like the Biblical Text Society or something like that. I took a look at it and I was disappointed with it. I think it's an okay translation, but it doesn't improve on the Thomas Taylor translation. If there is a controversy around this text, it's because it's a bit older, and so the English is stylistically a little bit more elevated and I think better than maybe the more toned down, less sophisticated common English that we're used to in the American middle class. There are occasions in some of the translations that Thomas Taylor did that he wrote additional sections to complete gaps in the original text, but that's only when there were gaps in the original text. So, for example, I think one of the works of Proclus has certain books in it, but there was like an additional book in it that was lost in antiquity, that people know there was like a sixth book of the Platonic theology. I don't know if that's the number. I didn't look it up. But one of the books of one of the main works of Proclus is missing. And so Thomas Taylor was like, well, I'll write that book and I'll just include it in my, I don't know if that's exactly controversial or not, but it is something that he did, but only when it wasn't, otherwise he's a good scholarly translator. And in fact, he's highly praised for understanding the Greek very well in these thinkers. And so his translations, although sometimes they don't exactly follow the grammar of the original Greek, they invariably capture the sense of the original Greek better than a more strict translation might. And he's often praised for that by other translators, that he gets into he's so good at the Greek that he doesn't have to completely literally translate it. He knows he knows what the writer is trying to say, and he knows, oh, well, this in English would be what they're trying to say here in the Greek, even if that isn't the exact expression or whatever. Anyway, back to language philosophy. I would say that there's several components of this in modern philosophy. So there's something called the language turn in philosophy that occurs in the 20th century and is particularly associated with not just logical positivism, but also many of the philosophers at Cambridge at the time, Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and so forth. And that was as a response to certain types of neo-Hegelianism that were going on in at Cambridge at the time, some of which Crowley was exposed to when he was an undergraduate, and the fact that he's sometimes citing or alluding to in some of his early philosophical essays. Also, there's what's called semiotics proper that originates with this fellow Saussure, Ferdinand Saussure, French linguist, and he has a series of lectures that he published that established what we now call linguistics as a field, distinct from other fields. But the study of language in this way is has some older components to it, and I would particularly emphasize what I call the transcendental turn in particularly German idealism. And that begins with Kant, Immanuel Kant, but then has its fullest expression in Hegel. And Hegel has a whole theory of language that basically is about how self-consciousness is posited by the social recognition that it receives from its historical context. And so the self is always, in this typically Hegelian dialectical way, the self is always being posited by others, and others are always being posited in virtue of the self. And so there's always this kind of mediated reciprocity. And so particularly then there's a theory of language in Hegel where language itself serves this primary mediating function in creating the world, and therefore also being the basis for the self-understanding, the manifestation of spirit or Geist, which is a kind of reflexive self-consciousness where human beings know themselves as the creators of their own world, and therefore that in a sense that they're the basis for their own truth. And so you no longer have to look towards an otherworldly beyond with a capital B to find the basis for spirit. That spirit for Hegel is concrete and immanent in human beings and their institutions in the way that we come to. And then this gets developed by the implications of that by later thinkers, whether that's Nietzsche or Kierkegaard or whoever. So this insight about language as being the basis for the construction of what phenomenologists call the life world is basic to much of modern philosophy, particularly from about the beginning of the 19th century on explicitly, but also implicitly before that. I do also want to note this is not foreign to ancient philosophy either. It may not be the major theme, but Plato, one of his dialogues, is about linguistics. It's about how different words in Greek are derived. Now, the etymologies that he proposes are kind of bogus, but the standards for that change over time. The way they wrote history back then is more mythological than we would now consider to be historiographically appropriate today, for example. But so you could say, well, Plato invents linguistics maybe, But then it doesn't have the same significance that it does for him, but it's there implicitly. And then Aristotle, of course, not only has a theory of language, he has a whole logic of how language works to make reference to things correctly or incorrectly. So all this is part of Aristotle as well, because logic is, he's the inventor of the type of logic that we use still today. It's been significantly expanded from the version that he used, but nevertheless, when you're maybe an undergraduate taking a logic course, you're still learning, at least in some ways, the logic that Aristotle has in his text, and that's about how language is used to say that either things are or are not the case. For example, you advance propositions, and in magic, you're kind of advancing propositions, aren't you? You're saying, I want the universe to be X, Y, or Z. I want this to be the case, meaning that this other thing is not going to be the case. If I'm performing a banishing ritual, there, in addition to the symbols I'm using, which are signs or signifiers that have a linguistic, symbolic function in terms of mediating my subjective relationship to the magical universe that I'm reorganizing around me when I perform the banishing ritual, the pentagram, or whatever. When I'm performing that ritual, when I define it as a banishing, I'm using a logical function that is, of course, grammatical, which is linguistic, which is to say that there's things that are good that I want to invoke and have present, and there's things that are bad that I want to banish. I want to leave the space, be dissolved and disrupted. And so in making that, and you draw the circle around the room to demarcate that boundary, but it's a boundary that's posited within this space of Oedipal socialization, within this linguistically constructed life world that's been formed around us, that has this virtual, ideal, spiritual aspect to it that is not simply and immediately reducible to the configuration of the atomic structure of the wall that's in front of me, which at a quantum level is completely indifferent to what I'm doing immediately in. It's kind of not really actually part of the conversation. What's magically relevant, and what's relevant to me when I'm performing that banishing ritual, is the significance of, the meaning of the things around me. And that's linguistic. That's not reducible to their mere presence as like atomically structured objects. And so you can't get around, at least from a modern philosophical point of view, this semiotic component. And in a way, Plato's aware of that too, because he's aware that the only reason the universe has intelligibility is because of this formal aspect, these forms. Well, what are those? Well, they're the meaning that we give to things, in virtue of which they are things for us in a world. And that has some kind of spiritual relationship to us, to our souls, that is not reducible to the mere physical presence of the world as a material object. And we can criticize that as a kind of dualism, and that's right to do, but there's something also that's deeply right and correct about Platonism. That's magically, there's a magical Gnostic insight that's going on here. We just have to figure out how to understand it correctly, so then it can re-signify it to us in a way that's useful. Maybe that answers that. But anybody else have any questions, or Taryn, how want me to say anything more?
No, thank you. That was comprehensive, and I followed all of that. So awesome.
Okay, Robert, go ahead.
I was wondering if you had thought of a follow-up course already, as crazy as that might sound.
Yeah, I've got a few ideas for that.
I'd like to throw something at you.
Okay, go ahead.
I see this course as the philosophical antecedents of Thelema. I like something that covered the spiritual antecedents of Thelema. In other words, you take a look at those maguses that are pointed out by Crowley. And I think this would be an important project for the AA, something I've always wanted to do myself, but never got around to it, where you would look at those spiritual foundations like Buddhism, and what did we keep in Thelema and what did Crowley throw out, and kind of
Right.
cover all the masters in that way successively, I think would be a very valuable course.
Yeah, that would be valuable to do. These 8 magi that represent these 7 spiritual traditions, and then Thelema as the 8th. And that, of course, there's more than 8 magi, so you could include other figures as well. That's just a particular canonical number because 8 is the number of Hod, which is the magician, and
Baphomet and all
so,
that.
right. Another Another thing we could do is a course on the Thelemic theogony, so some of the main deities or god forms, and that would be a way of talking about some of the way this works with the tree of life as well. I'd have some interest in doing that also. There's also, we could do a modern continuation of, because we were doing the Renaissance and classical sources for this course. We could have a follow-up course where we now move forward from the Renaissance and are looking at Baroque and other later modern figures like the Theosophical Society, Emanuel Swedenborg, Jacob Burma, other figures that have a direct relationship to Thelema. And I did a course at a graduate seminar at the Graduate Theological Union on some of these figures. And so perhaps either later this year or early next year, we could think about having a course where I do sort of the other half of what we're covering here. I also like the idea of doing a Thelemic theogony course because I've got some material I built up around some of these figures that might be interesting to have a chance to talk about. Anyway, those are all things that we could do. I wanted to see if Joe, if you had anything you wanted to ask or comment on.
Yeah, well, I'm curious if you could talk more about Iamblichus's idea of the Holy Guardian Angel and how it might be similar and differ from the Mathers, Crowley vision or the Abraham Allen vision. I also think of Crowley one time points, he correlates like the Ishva Devata from the Yoga Sutras is another correlate to the personal God.
Sure.
The Yoga Sutras to the Holy Guardian Angel too. So I'm curious, is that maybe where Iamblichus is kind of like coming from, like a personal deity or Godhead?
Well, it's the thing that mediates you with the Godhead. So the transcendent one is completely impersonal. So it's not the same as the God of monotheism, who is a personal God that you can have a personal, direct relationship to, and who acts in history. The Platonic divine is outside of time and space and doesn't enter into direct communication. And so there have to be these mediating levels to bring the personal soul into knowledge and conversation or dialogue with the ground of being. And so the idea is that the higher daimon, the particular or peculiar here just meaning particular daimon, is serving that function. It has this mediating role. For Iamblichus, there's a few, I pointed out the ways in which this is very similar to the Thelemic or Golden Dawn doctrine. There's also some differences. So for example, in the Thelemic concept of the Holy Guardian Angel, setting aside the Golden Dawn version for a moment, which has some internal complexity to it that would really require its own class to go over all the documents and see how it kind of adds up. And Crowley's version is in a way both a simplified, but also he makes certain interpretive choices. So in the Thelemic version, the Holy Guardian Angel is a kind of higher and divine self. It's the totalization or the totality of the psyche. So it's a little bit like what Jung calls the self with a capital S. It's the unity of the psyche, inclusive of the unconscious and the conscious, which are usually separated. When you get those two into conversation, this third function of the unity of the two then emerges, the self with the capital S. So in Kabbalistic terms, that would be when the Ruach and the Nefesh are able to integrate with each other, then this third function, the Neshama, is able to manifest itself as the spiritual unity or totalization of these two otherwise often separated and antagonistic parts of the psyche, the conscious and unconscious elements of ourselves that are so often in this kind of traumatized fight, basically, kind of fight with ourselves, where we aren't able to be the person that we want to be. And so then this third function stands for this neshama, or the holy guardian angel. So that means that to put this in personal terms, the holy guardian angel that I'm summoning is myself. And that's why I am the one who can preeminently summon and invoke it, and why my union with it is indissoluble, because it's me. I can't, in a sense, at the most fundamental level, not be me. And so it's the aspect of me that is unalienable, but which also then calls for refinement and communicative understanding. And so it's great for me to say that, but then that has to mean something psychologically, which then requires work, and so on and so forth. Okay, in the Iamblican version, the particular daimon is an entity that is separate from the soul, that just like you would summon an angel or spirit or God, and that would appear to you, and then you'd send it off to do things, and that would be separate from your soul. It wouldn't be the same as you. In the same way, the particular demon is uniquely assigned to you, but is separate from the uniqueness of your soul. But just in the same way as your soul isn't uniquely totalized in the way it is, as we experience it as modern people, but is the soul for ancient peoples was this very permeable thing that was constantly being possessed from outside by different entities. In a similar way, you're trying to affect theurgic union by being possessed by your own particular demon, which then is efficacious to then elevate your soul to the divine. So it's like it's a good possession, because there's good or bad possessions depending on what the circumstances are. So this is like the best possession that you can have, is this particular demon who's been assigned to you to serve this particular function of energizing you magically, so that you're then this more effective. You can then have this demiurgic function. Now, because the particular demon is understood as being ontologically separate or distinct from your soul, it can also change. So at one point, Iamblichus writes about how you might have a particular demon assigned to you at your birth, but then when you achieve theurgic union, that demon is replaced by a better demon that more effectively affects the theurgic union. And I think he has in mind someone who's like a reformed member of the criminal classes or whatever, who was being led by a bad daimon because his soul was assigned to punishment by the divine. And so that's why he was born into the lower classes and was a slave. But then at a certain point, he's manumitted and he becomes a member of the temple, and then he's participating in the priestly rites. And okay, well, now he's a quote unquote good person because he's joined the higher classes and learned to read and write. And so now he's, from being a bad person, now he's become a good person. How do we explain that? Well, he must have had the daimon that he had previously that was assigning his soul to damnation and to punishment and making him be vulgar and vicious. And now that's been replaced by the gods with a better daimon that's now leading him in the way of holiness. Or Iamblichus says what could happen instead is that you get a new daimon who's the new holier daimon, but you don't lose the previous daimon, but now that becomes subordinate to the daimon that's now the next one higher up. And so the daimon that's higher up possesses the slightly lower particular daimon that then possesses your soul, and then so you're linked through this chain then, and you're able to go for. So those particularities of how to like divide it up into almost like a more complex system, Crowley sticks to a more kind of simpler model that is a little bit more poetic. Some of the texts in the Golden Dawn have this more complex set of daimons, so you can like have your soul in Asya come into communication with your higher divine self in Yetzirah, and then your higher divine self in Yetzirah, it has a higher divine self in Bria that it has to then get in communication with, and then your higher divine self in Bria will then have a higher divine self in Absolute, which is God, and then you'll be united with God that way. And that's a little bit more like the Iamblican version, but Crowley kind of does away with that, and he just has the one higher and divine spirit that's the holy guardian angel, which is also your own higher and divine self. And then, although there might be some texts where he's a little bit ambiguous about that too at certain moments, but that's basically, at least most of the time in Thelemic texts, this kind of more streamlined version. So Joe, does that make sense?
Yeah. As you said, I think Crowley, he kind of goes back and forth between those two throughout his career, like in his writings. It seems like because sometimes he believes it's something separate, and sometimes he talks about it being part of his own brain.
I think, yes, he does. And I would say that what is characteristic about this ambiguity in Crowley is that he's, at least most of the time, he's consistently ambiguous about whether the holy guardian angel is a praetor-human intelligence that's separate from his self, whatever that's supposed to be, or it's a deeper and higher function of his own, unifying function of his own psychology, basically. And from Crowley's magical methodology, which, if we remember, is skeptical and pragmatic, he doesn't have to make up his mind, because from a skeptical and pragmatic point of view, practically, it doesn't matter which it is, because the effect is the same. You invoke the angel and you're able to invoke creative ecstasy, which is the goal of your practice, which infuses your life with meaning and purpose, and you know who you are and what you're doing. And that communicates the gnosis of the true will to you. Well, practically, it doesn't matter if that's being communicated with you by a higher function of your own psychology, or if that's some supernatural or praetor-human, Crowley prefers, rather than saying supernatural, being that has maybe some kind of ontological separation or distinction from you at the same time. And there might even be a way to mediate these two point of views. And but Crowley doesn't necessarily propose to himself that he needs to be the one to do that. That for him, in terms of what he's trying to do, he's content to have a methodology that is pragmatic and skeptical, and so he can remain in the skeptical aporia of a kind of both end, where he could say, well, it's either one or the other, and I don't, or it could be both, or I don't need to make up my mind, because so I'm just going to put them both, I'm just going to keep putting them both on the table, basically. But here's all the practices that get you into communication with this theurgic function that is objective, in the sense that if you do these practices, these results will happen. So is light a particle or a wave? Well, it depends how you measure it. Is the holy guardian angel a praetor-human intelligence or a higher function of your own psyche? Well, it depends how you interpret it. There's your answer from a modern magical perspective. And again, we don't have to necessarily be critically in our own critical engagement with these texts. We can have our own ideas and theories about this, and we don't have to. We can be dissatisfied or satisfied with what with Crowley's ambiguity. I have my own dialectical and materialist theories about this, some of which I've talked about during this course, and no doubt will have more to say in the future. But in the Thelemic tradition as a whole, both of these options remain open for discussion, that they're part of the conversation. And again, that's the reason to read these texts as well, to keep the conversation open and understand our tradition historically in its full articulated complexity. And then we are part of this really big tent that has all this diverse conversation that's going on, that's very rich, that's very interesting, and that integrates us with a whole long conversation with a lot of different interesting people in the past, and we can continue that now. And again, and I've said this before in the class, and I'll say it again, it's a nice way to end the class as well. The problem only emerges when the dogmatist comes along. And they say, I know the truth, and it's the one truth, and there's no other way to look at or do this or practice this, and this is it, and everybody else has to obey me, and this interpretation, or they're bad people, and we're going to find a way to scapegoat and punish them. And that's why it's so important that there's this skeptical component to the methodology of magic. Not because as individual critical thinkers, we're not going to have our own theories that we think are right, but in terms of keeping the tradition as a whole open to a conversation where there's always going to be more than one opinion, and where we avoid, when we are presenting our opinions, we present them as our theory and as our position that is an opinion, and that isn't dogmatically presented as the only possible way to do magic. Okay, we've got just a few minutes more. Any more questions, comments, closing remarks before we complete this first course segment of Esoteric Antecedents of Thelema, Renaissance and Antique Magic and Mysticism? Robert or Taryn, anything you want to say to close us out? Robert, go ahead.
I just want to say thank you very much. I enjoyed the entire thing. There is still a couple more that I haven't viewed yet, but I will catch up on those. But I sat in on 4 and viewed 1 and enjoyed them all thoroughly. I think you did an excellent job. So thank you very much for sharing with us.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much. It's really great to have the chance to present this material to the community. And for at least a short while, these videos are going to be available for the people who paid money to be part of this class. But in a bit, we're going to start publishing these on probably on a weekly basis on my YouTube channel, which is entitled Liberation Theurgy with Dr. Nathan Theurgy. And so this will
I believe I already subscribed.
Yes. And so this will be some nice content for that. And then I hope that we can do some future courses and other types of things for the community. This format seems to be working pretty well. And anyway, I think that's it for the class. Thanks everybody for joining us for this, or who are watching this later in whatever format. Keep engaged, and let's see if we can keep that bar raised for level of discourse in the Thelemic and magical communities. And remember that we're part of this ancient, really rich and interesting tradition, and this is our heritage. We can talk about that and really engage with the diversity, the multicultural complexity of that conversation, which has a lot of relevance to what we're doing. Anyway, thanks everybody. Love is the law, love under will.